going to come back to your calls on this in just a moment, because I do want to address something that's happened in Brazil. What with the rise of the far right and the far left and populist right-wing and populist left-wing politics all over the world, in Brazil, the candidate that's being described as far right, and of course I use that term cautiously now because you never know if it's far right or populist right in the particular candidate until you look into them. But Brazil's so-called far right presidential frontrunner, Jair Bolsonaro, I hope I pronounced that correctly, is recovering in hospital after being stabbed during an election rally, stabbed by somebody who would be described as the opposite end of the spectrum, used to be a member of a fringe hard left political group. So he says he's fine and he's recovering. He nearly died in hospital. The candidate's son said he was likely to unable to resume his campaigning ahead of October's vote. But that may well have implications on the elections in Brazil. To joining us is Dr. William Booth, who's going to speak to us about what this means for the Brazilian elections. Welcome, Dr. William. Thank you for joining us.
Hi there. I don't think you have any hesitation about using the term far right when speaking about Bolsonaro, by the way.
All right. Is he populist right or far right?
Well, he's popular with a certain group of people, but when you think about the kind of things he's called for, I mean, he's extremely misogynistic, he's extremely homophobic, he's called for violence in politics, which is interesting in relation to this stabbing. I mean, previously he's called for the military to intervene in Brazilian politics, and most recently at a rally he called for leftists to be machine gunned. So it's not.
Sounds like a fascist.
He's in that ballpark, and he's a Bible, bullets and beef candidate. He's for the cattle ranchers. He's close to certain churches, and he's very much in favour of gun ownership and solving things with violence. And it's not necessarily surprising that this really come back to bite him. He uses a lot of that language.
And so do you think, William, that the fact that he's now obviously cast as a victim, he's been stabbed, and therefore he is a victim under criminal law, will that have an effect, the opposite effect to the intended effect, one assumes, that the attacker had?
Yeah, it's very hard to know, and I wouldn't want to speculate too much about the motivations of the attacker, who we're told has this history of being part of left-wing groups, but also possibly has a series of other problems or health issues. So I think it's too early to say what precisely was going through their mind at that time. But you're right to pick up on the fact that this may boost his popularity to some extent. We've seen this with presidential candidates in other contexts where a failed assassination attempt or an attack is then spun as a kind of heroic incident. So yes, it's a bit early to tell, I'd say.
Speak to me on a broader sense, because the reason I equivocated over populist right, and I'm not meaning popular by that, but populist and far right, is because we spoke earlier on in this show to an expert on the Swedish situation with the Sweden Democrats, who have their origins in the neo-Nazi party there, and he said he would describe them as populist right as opposed to far right, because he says they have genuinely shed some of their more Nazi elements in their origins, yet they are still, of course, he said, a troubling phenomenon. So whether it's in Sweden or in Brazil, or of course in with Italy and the Five Star Movement, in Denmark and other places, we're seeing the rise of extremely polarized politics. What do you think in a general sense is behind that?
In the Brazilian context, which has its own very particular history of military dictatorship, the growth of this big opposition movement at the Workers' Party that Lula was so closely associated with, and who's now in jail, of course, and won't be participating in the forthcoming election. That was very oppositional. There was a violent government, and there were strongly well-organised oppositions. Not all the Workers' Party, of course. It was a very broad-based opposition, but they came to really to exemplify that opposition. To talk about a kind of easy distinction between populist right and far right, I think is tricky, and particularly in the Brazilian context, because Jair Bolsonaro comes from a very small party, the Social Liberal Party, which is woefully misnamed. They only have 9 deputies in the Congress of over 500. They don't have any senators. They're a tiny party.
William, sorry, did I hear you correctly that he calls himself a socialist?
No, it's the Social Liberal Party.
Oh, Social Liberal Party, even worse.
Yeah, neither social nor liberal. These party names in Brazil are extremely misleading and confusing. Yeah. But there's the party system in Brazil is extremely fragmented. There are dozens of parties, and people move between parties all the time. So it's not a good indication of how Congress is going to line up after the election. It's not a good indication of who's going to be president, because the president is a very personality-based contest in Brazil, and they then construct, often post facto, a very uncomfortable coalition. And we saw that with Dilma Rousseff, the previous president, who had Temer, the current right-wing president, as her deputy.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's Dr. William Booth. Thank you very much for speaking to us. Lecturer in modern history at the University of Oxford, specialising in Latin America, speaking to us about the Brazilian presidential front runner, apparently, Jair Bolsonaro, who's been recovering in hospital after being stabbed by an activist that has a history in, at least, far-left activism. Yet, of course, the motive for the attack remains a matter for the police to investigate. You're listening to Majid Nawaz here on LBC, and the time is 2:49.